She was not born with serpents in her hair. She did not emerge from some primordial darkness with stone in her gaze and venom in her heart. Before the curse, before the cave, before 1,000 heroes sharpened their blades and dreamed of glory at her expense, Medusa was something far more dangerous than a monster. She was beautiful, and in the world of gods, beauty is never a gift. It is a sentence. The ancient Greeks understood something we have largely forgotten, that the line between maiden and monster is drawn not by nature, but by the hands of the powerful. That those we call creatures of nightmare were often, once, simply women who suffered at the wrong hands, in the wrong place, under the gaze of the wrong god. Medusa's story is not the tale of a beast who terrorized mankind. It is the story of how mankind, and the gods who shaped them, created the very thing they learned to fear. And if you listen closely, past the clash of bronze and the hiss of serpents, you will hear something far more unsettling than any monster's cry. You will hear the silence of a woman who was never given the chance to speak. To understand Medusa, we must first understand what she was before the transformation. The sources vary, as ancient sources often do, but the poet Ovid paints the most vivid portrait in his Metamorphoses. Medusa was a priestess in the temple of Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, patron of heroes and craftsmen. But she was no ordinary priestess. In a world where the gods hoarded beauty for themselves, Medusa's mortal loveliness rivaled the divine. Her hair, they said, was her greatest glory. Not the writhing nest of serpents we imagine now, but cascading locks of silk and shadow that caught the Mediterranean light like woven gold. Suitors came from distant kingdoms, not to worship Athena, but simply to catch a glimpse of the priestess who served her. They left offerings not at the altar, but at Medusa's feet. Picture the temple as it was then. Marble columns reaching toward an attic sky, the scent of burning laurel drifting through the sacred halls, the soft echo of sandaled feet on ancient stone. Medusa moved through this world like a creature between realms, mortal enough to age, beautiful enough to seem divine. She had taken vows. She had given her life to the gray-eyed goddess. In an age when women had few choices, she had chosen devotion, chosen purity, chosen a life of sacred service over marriage and motherhood. The temple was her sanctuary. Its walls were her protection. Or so she believed. But even temples cannot keep out gods who do not wish to be refused. Poseidon, lord of the wine-dark seas, earth-shaker and storm-bringer, had watched Medusa for some time. The gods are not subtle in their desires. They do not court, they do not ask. When an Olympian wants something, the universe tends to bend around their wanting. And Poseidon wanted the beautiful priestess who had sworn herself to his niece. Perhaps it was her very unavailability that drew him. Perhaps it was simply that gods, like men, often desire most fiercely what they cannot rightfully claim. The ancient texts do not give us Poseidon's reasoning. They rarely do, when it comes to the crimes of the powerful. What they give us is the act itself. He found her in the temple. In Athena's own sacred space, on cold marble floors consecrated to the virgin goddess, Poseidon took what he wanted. The word the Greeks used was not gentle, it was not ambiguous. Medusa did not consent, she did not surrender, she was violated. And when it was over, when the god of seas returned to his underwater palaces and his own divine concerns, Medusa was left alone in the defiled sanctuary. A priestess who was no longer pure, a servant of Athena who had been claimed by another. And here is where the story takes its cruelest turn. Athena knew, the gods always know. From her seat on Olympus, the gray-eyed goddess witnessed her uncle's crime. She saw her priestess weeping on temple stones. She saw the violation of her sacred space, and she made a choice. Not to punish Poseidon. He was an Olympian, her father's brother, untouchable in his power. To challenge him would be to challenge the order of things, and Athena, for all her wisdom, was a goddess who valued order above almost everything. So she turned her wrath not toward the perpetrator, but toward the victim. Not toward the god who had committed sacrilege, but toward the woman who had suffered it. We must pause here. We must sit with this injustice, because to rush past it is to miss the entire point of the myth. Athena, goddess of wisdom. Athena, patron of heroes, champion of the clever and the just. Athena looked at a woman who had served her faithfully, who had been violated in her own temple by a god Medusa had no power to refuse, and Athena punished her. The wisdom goddess chose cruelty. The virgin goddess chose to blame the victim. This is not an accident of storytelling. This is the ancient Greeks telling us something they understood with bitter clarity. That power protects power. That justice flows downward, never up. That those who suffer at the hands of the mighty will often find themselves blamed for their suffering. The transformation was horrific. Medusa's celebrated beauty twisted into something nightmarish. Her skin took on the pallor of deep-sea creatures, her features sharpening into something not quite human. Her hands curved into claws, her legs fused and scaled. But most terrible of all was what happened to that glorious hair, the hair that poets had compared to sunlight on the Aegean. Each strand thickened, darkened, came alive. Serpents, hundreds of them, hissing and coiling where silk had once flowed. They would never sleep, they would never be still. For the rest of her existence, Medusa would feel them moving against her scalp, their cold scales a constant reminder of what she had become. And then there were her eyes. Once they had been deep enough to drown in, beautiful enough to start wars. Now, anyone who met her gaze would turn to stone. Permanently, irreversibly. Medusa could never look upon another living face again. Not in love, not in friendship, not even in hatred. Every glance was a death sentence. She had been transformed into the ultimate isolation, a creature who could never again experience connection without killing. Athena had not merely punished Medusa, she had erased her. The priestess was gone. In her place stood something that would be hunted for centuries. Medusa fled. What choice did she have? She could not return to human society. One accidental glance and everyone she had ever known would become statuary. She could not remain in Greece, where heroes would eventually come seeking glory at her expense. She traveled to the edges of the known world, to a desolate place where the land meets the Western Ocean, and the sun dies each evening in waters the color of blood. There, in a cave worn smooth by countless lonely years, she made her home. If you could call it a home, it was more a prison, a tomb for the living. She was not alone, at least not entirely. Her sisters, Astheno and Euryale, found her there. In some versions, they had always been Gorgons, immortal and monstrous from birth. In others, they transformed alongside Medusa, sharing her curse out of sisterly love or divine spite. Either way, they stayed. Two immortal monsters guarding their mortal sister in a cave at the end of the world. But even their company must have been cold comfort. Astheno and Euryale could look at each other without consequence. Only Medusa carried the killing gaze. Only Medusa was truly alone, even in the presence of those she loved. The years passed, then decades, then centuries perhaps, though the myths are vague on such details. Medusa's cave became a gallery of horrors. The stone figures multiplied. Warriors who had come seeking fame. Hunters who had stumbled upon her lair by accident. Perhaps travelers who had simply lost their way. Each one now stood frozen in their final moment, faces twisted in expressions of shock or terror, or sometimes, most heartbreaking of all, wonder. They had come expecting a monster. They had found one. And in their last living instant, some of them must have seen something in Medusa's face that surprised them. Not rage, not malice, something far more human, something like sorrow. We do not know what Medusa thought during those long ages of exile. The myths are not interested in the inner lives of monsters, but we can imagine the endless replaying of that night in the temple, the prayers to Athena that were never answered, the gradual acceptance that she would never again feel the sun on her face in a crowded marketplace, never again hear her name spoken with anything other than fear. Perhaps she came to hate them, the heroes who arrived with their polished shields and their righteous certainty. Or perhaps she simply grew tired. Tired of being the monster in someone else's story. Tired of dying the same death over and over in the tales men told to make themselves feel brave. And then came Perseus. Of all the heroes who would eventually seek Medusa's head, Perseus was the most unlikely. He was young, barely more than a boy. He had no army, no kingdom, no particular skill at arms. What he had was a problem. King Polydectes of Seriphos had set his eyes on Perseus's mother, Danae, and the young man stood in the way. So the king issued a challenge he believed impossible. "Bring me the head of Medusa." It was meant to be a death sentence disguised as a quest. The king expected Perseus to die in some distant cave, leaving Danae unprotected. But Perseus had something Polydectes did not anticipate. He had divine blood. His father was Zeus himself, who had visited Danae in a shower of golden light while she was imprisoned by her own father. And when Zeus's son prayed for help, the Olympians answered. Athena came first, bearing a shield of polished bronze, its surface smooth as still water. "Look only at her reflection," the goddess counseled. "Never meet her gaze directly." Hermes followed, offering winged sandals that would carry Perseus across seas and continents, and a cap of invisibility borrowed from Hades himself, and a sword of adamantine, unbreakable and ever sharp. The gods armed Perseus as if for war against a nation. All of this to kill one woman in a cave. His journey took him to the Grey Sisters, 3 ancient beings who shared a single eye and a single tooth between them. He stole their eye and ransomed it for information. The nymphs of the north provided him with a magical satchel, the cabesus, which alone could contain Medusa's head without turning its bearer to stone. Thus equipped, thus blessed by the very gods who had created the monster he hunted, Perseus flew toward the western edge of the world. He found the cave as the sun was setting. The stone figures were the first warning. A merchant still clutching his wares, a soldier with sword half drawn, a young man who might have been a suitor, frozen mid-stride, his face still wearing the expression of someone who has just seen something impossibly beautiful. Perseus moved past them carefully, the soft beat of his winged sandals stirring dust that had lain undisturbed for generations. The cap of Hades rendered him invisible. The shield of Athena he held before him like a mirror. Inside the cave, the darkness was absolute. But something moved in that darkness. Something hissed, not one voice but hundreds, a sibilant chorus that echoed off wet stone walls. Perseus raised his shield and caught the reflection. There she was, Medusa. After all the stories, all the preparation, all the gifts of gods, there she was. What he saw in that polished bronze was not quite what he expected. Yes, the serpents were there, coiling and restless, their scales catching what little light filtered into the cave. Yes, the face was monstrous, sharp-featured and pale. But there was something else, something tired, something ancient and weary, and somehow, impossibly, sad. Medusa was sleeping. The monster who could kill with a glance lay curled on cold stone, her serpent hair settling into drowsy stillness, her breathing slow and deep. In sleep, she almost looked peaceful, almost human. Perseus did not hesitate. Heroes rarely do. The adamantine sword sang through the dark air, and before Medusa could wake, before she could defend herself or flee or even understand what was happening, the blade found her neck. One stroke. Clean. Final. The head fell away from the body, and the hissing of the serpents rose to a frenzy before, slowly, horribly, going silent. Medusa was dead. The priestess who had become a monster, who had become a legend, was simply gone. But the story did not end with her death. From the severed neck, from the golden blood that flowed where mortal red should have been, two figures emerged. Chrysaor, a giant who would become father to monsters of his own, and Pegasus, the winged horse, white as cloud, swift as thought, beautiful beyond description. Medusa had been pregnant. The children of Poseidon, conceived in that terrible violation, had grown within her throughout her long exile. Only in death were they finally born. There is something almost unbearably tragic in this detail. All those years in the cave, Medusa carried within her the offspring of her rapist, and they were beautiful. One became a monster. One became a symbol of poetic inspiration itself. Both emerged from a murder. Perseus collected his prize. The kibyssus contained the head safely, its deadly gaze neutralized by the magic satchel. He flew back across the world, and the head of Medusa continued to serve purposes long after its owner was dead. On his journey home, Perseus used it to turn a sea monster to stone, saving the princess Andromeda, who would become his wife. He used it to petrify King Polydectes and his entire court, ending the threat to his mother forever. He used it to turn Atlas, the titan who held up the sky, into the mountain range that still bears his name. Medusa's death continued to kill long after her living heart had stopped beating. Eventually, Perseus gave the head to Athena, a gift for his patron goddess. Athena set it into her shield, the Aegis, where it would terrify her enemies for eternity. Think about this. The goddess who had punished Medusa for being a victim now wore that victim's face as a weapon. She had transformed a priestess into a monster, and then transformed that monster into an accessory. Medusa's suffering became Athena's power. Her curse became the goddess's armor. Even in death, Medusa served the one who had wronged her most. But here is what most retellings miss, what they rush past in their eagerness to celebrate Perseus's heroism. Medusa never attacked anyone who did not first come to attack her. In every single account, every ancient source, she is found in her cave, hiding, waiting, existing. The heroes come to her. The glory seekers come to her. She does not hunt them. She does not terrorize villages or demand sacrifices. She simply lives, if you can call it living, in the most remote place she could find, as far from humanity as possible. And still they come, sword in hand, expecting medals for killing a woman who only wanted to be left alone. There is a reason Medusa has endured in the human imagination far longer than the hero who killed her. Perseus fades. His quest becomes one among many, interchangeable with Jason's or Theseus's or any other young man with a destiny and a sharp blade. But Medusa remains. Her image adorns temples and shields and jewelry. Her face appears on everything from ancient coins to modern fashion houses. We cannot stop looking at her, perhaps because somewhere, in the collective unconscious of our species, we recognize the truth of her story. She is not the villain. She never was. The Greeks knew this, even if they could not always articulate it. They placed her image on their shields not to invoke evil, but to ward it off. The Gorgonean, Medusa's face, was apotropaic, a symbol of protection. They understood that her gaze, which turned men to stone, could also freeze enemies with fear, that her horror was also, somehow, her power. In some versions of the mythology, her blood had healing properties. From one side of her neck flowed poison that could kill instantly. From the other, a medicine that could raise the dead. Even in death, Medusa contained multitudes. The Romans called her Medusa, but the Greeks had another name, Gorgo, from a word meaning terrible or dreadful or overwhelming. And yes, she was all of these things. But she was also beautiful once. She was devoted, she was innocent. And all of that was taken from her not because of anything she did, but because of what was done to her. The monster was made, not born. In modern times, feminist scholars have reclaimed Medusa as a symbol of female rage, and rightly so. She represents every woman who has been punished for the violence done to her. Every victim blamed for her own victimhood. Every voice silenced by those with the power to define who is monster and who is hero. When we look at Medusa now, we see not a beast to be slain, but a wound that is never healed. The story is thousands of years old, but the pattern it describes still shapes lives today. And perhaps that is why we keep telling it. Not because it offers easy answers or comfortable morals, but because it insists we look at something we would rather avoid. The gaze of Medusa turns men to stone, but the story of Medusa turns a mirror towards society itself. Who do we call monsters? Who do we arm with swords and bless with divine favor? Whose suffering do we celebrate, and whose do we erase? The Greeks could not have known that their myth would resonate across millennia. But they knew something about human nature. They knew that power corrupts, that the innocent suffer, and that the stories we tell about monsters say more about us than about the creatures themselves. In the end, Medusa did not die because she was dangerous. She died because she was convenient. A young hero needed a quest. A goddess needed to prove her power could not be challenged. A king needed a rival removed. Medusa's head was a currency exchanged between men and gods, her life a token spent for their benefit. And now that head stares out from Athena's shield with eyes that no longer kill, but somehow still accuse. What are you looking at? Those serpent-framed eyes seem to ask. And more importantly, what are you failing to see? The ruins of temples to Athena still stand across Greece and beyond. Tourists walk through them, cameras in hand, marveling at the craftsmanship of ancient artisans. If you look carefully at the surviving stonework, you may find her there. Medusa's face carved into corners and capitals, not hiding but watching. After all this time, after all the heroes and all the swords, she is still there. And she will be there long after we are gone. Perhaps that is the final truth of her story, that monsters once created cannot truly be killed. They endure in memory, in symbol, in the uncomfortable questions they force us to ask. Somewhere beyond the edge of the known world, where the sun meets the sea in dying fire, there is a cave full of statues. The waves crash against ancient rocks. The serpents have long since turned to stone themselves. But sometimes when the wind is right and the light falls at a certain angle, you can almost imagine a woman sitting in the darkness. Not a monster, just a woman. Still waiting, after all these centuries, for someone to tell her story true. For someone to look at her not as a trophy or a symbol or a monster, but as what she was before all of this began. A priestess, beautiful, devoted, and terribly, unforgivably alone. The Greeks believed that to name a thing was to give it power. They whispered the names of certain gods, afraid to attract their attention. But they spoke Medusa's name freely, wrote it on shields and stamped it on coins. They were not afraid of her. Not really. They were afraid of what she represented. That any one of them could suffer as she suffered. That the gods they worshipped could be arbitrary, cruel, monstrously unfair. that the heroes they celebrated could be, in their own way, villains to someone else's story. Medusa held up a mirror to ancient Greece, and what the Greeks saw in that mirror turned them, if not to stone, then to something harder to define. Something that endures. Look at her if you dare, not the monster of popular imagination, but the woman beneath the serpents. The priestess before the transformation. The victim before she became a villain in someone else's narrative. Meet her gaze, not in polished bronze but in honest reflection, and ask yourself the question that her story has been asking for 3,000 years. In a world where the powerful can unmake the innocent, where justice flows downhill and suffering is rewarded with more suffering, what would you do? Would you become the hero with the sword, the goddess with the shield, or would you find yourself someday alone in a cave at the edge of the world, transformed by forces beyond your control into something you never wanted to be, waiting in darkness for an ending that was written before you were born? Medusa does not answer. She never could, but her story speaks loudly enough for those willing to listen. And perhaps, in the telling and retelling, in the centuries of art and interpretation and reclamation, she has finally found what she could never have in life. A voice, not hissing through serpent tongues, but echoing through human hearts. The monster speaks at last, and what she says is this: "Remember me, not as I was made, but as I was. Remember that before the cave, before the curse, before the hero came with his borrowed sword and his borrowed courage, there was a girl who lit incense to a goddess and believed she would be protected. Remember that she was wrong. And remember, when next you tell a story of monsters and heroes, to ask which is which."